Hi, and welcome to the latest episode of History You Didn't Know But Should. I'm Ray.
And I'm Chris.
In this episode, we're going to be looking at something that's very relevant, and that is the presidential nomination of cabinet members. And Chris, this is a very interesting topic because of what's going on in the news right now with President-elect Donald Trump as he works to appoint his cabinet. But as we both know, and hopefully our listeners know, these are positions that many of them will have to go through the Senate for what the Constitution calls advice and consent. So it's not as easy as just appointing. There's a process that must happen, that must take place, that can and sometimes does result in a cabinet member, a nominee for a cabinet position being withdrawn or being rejected by the Senate.
So, being the history nerds that we are, I mean, the presidential election was fascinating, just everything leading up to it and the election. But now that we have a person who has been selected or elected by the people, we now are moving into this part three of the crazy tour, of presidential life. We now know that former president, soon to be reelected president Trump, is going to come into power. And, I mean, we need to recognize that the president leads a vast federal government. He is part of the executive branch, but you have the legislative and the judicial branch. But the federal government, he can't do it on his own. And so you have this opportunity where you get to hire as the president a group of close advisors to join you in making the changes that are needed for the respective government to not just cast the vision, but to make the vision become a reality. And so, the president chooses the people that he feels are capable of leading the government. Not in all positions. I mean, there are some positions it's just the president has the right. But there are some positions, especially in this thing that is known as the cabinet, in which there has to be, let's just say, checks and balances, in which the Senate comes in. The Senate is like the big brother of Congress, and they get to come in and say, okay, sure, this person is good for UN ambassador, or yes, this person is good in to be health of human services. But they might also say, hey, we don't feel comfortable that this is the right pick for you. As you mentioned, it doesn't happen often. It's been a long, long time since it has, been to the point where somebody's been rejected. But Ray, it is a checks and balances. And I do think because, once again, just because we have now come across President Trump going to be president, the reality is it's still 50-50. There's still a group of people that think that we are headed in the wrong direction. People think we're headed in the right direction. It's still divided. And so you now have the legislature, which has this unenviable task of trying to make sure that the train stays on the right tracks. And that starts with, all right, who's going to be your closest advisors who are going to have power to be able to do things in the various branches of federal government?
Yeah, the cabinet is not mentioned in the Constitution. This is one of those things that is not mentioned in the Constitution. What the Constitution does say is that, and this is from Article 2, which deals with the president, Section 2, that he or she may require the opinion in writing of the principal officer in each of the executive departments upon any subject relating to the duties of their respective offices. So that's not establishing a cabinet. That's just saying, okay, there are going to be these major department heads, and the president has the authority to request from them information. The cabinet itself, the first cabinet, is put together by none other than President George Washington, the first president of the United States, of course. And he's the one that, puts together this cabinet. He's got Secretary of State Thomas Jefferson. He's got Secretary of War Henry Knox. He's got Secretary of Treasury Alexander Hamilton. Attorney General, I believe, was Edmund Randolph. I mean, that was the first cabinet. And Chris, I think most people would agree in a lot of ways, probably the height of the cabinet. Because throughout American history, throughout presidential history, some presidents have leaned heavily on their cabinet, then other presidents have not leaned heavily on their cabinet. And you have cabinet appointments that are good, and then you have cabinet appointments that are not so good. But Article 2 of the Constitution also says, when we're talking about this advice and consent role of the Senate, that the Senate has that the president has the authority to nominate, among other things, all other officers of the United States, which would include the cabinet. That it says that the Senate must advise, that is, give advice and consent. And over throughout American history, as you know, Chris, this has sort of evolved into what it is today. Initially they didn't have hearings, or like we do today. They certainly didn't have televised hearings, but the way we sort of do it today is different than what it was. But it still boils down to, as you said a minute ago, the Senate does have the ability to look at a president's choice for Secretary of State, for example, and say, we're not approving that one.
Yeah, and a lot of it comes down to politics. Well, all of it comes down to politics. I mean, it's going to be easier for President Trump to get his people into power, or into government roles, shouldn't say power, but into government roles this time around, because he is operating with a Republican, soon to be Republican led Senate. So if that was to happen, he would have a Republican led Senate. You would think it would be a pretty quick process. If the Democrats are in power, it's going to be a lot harder for this to kind of take place. But how does this work? Because people might be saying, I hear about advice and consent. I mean, the guy wants this guy, just let it be. But basically, what you're talking about happening is pretty much immediately after you win, after election day and you win, you begin the process of saying, all right, this is who I want to head up these agencies, because there's going to have to be some transition. There's going to have to be some getting familiar with things. And so, let's say that you were president of the United States. That would be something. But let's say Ray Shepard, yes, that you're president of the United States, and that you decide, that you want to elect, me to be your Secretary of State. Well, you think that I would make a great Secretary of State, but maybe I don't have all the qualifications, or maybe I'm not, knowledgeable when it comes to foreign affairs or things of that nature. So what then happens is the Senate comes in, and the Senate can say, you know what, we're going to have these confirmation hearings. We're just going to go through the process because we want to make sure that this person who is going to head this agency, is the right person. So sometimes they could be quick, sometimes they could be long, but that's advice and consent. We're going to, Mr. President, thank you for selecting, Chris Carroll to be Secretary of State. We've asked some questions, we've discussed, we've talked about some things, and so we approve him. Good job, move on. Or it could be, no, I'll tell you, some things have come up. Do you know that he doesn't even know that, Africa is a continent, or something like that? You might be saying, well, that person's not really qualified for this job. So therefore, Mr. President, we're sorry, but on advice and consent of the United States Senate, we're just going to ask you to go pick another person. So that's an important part, because I do think the government is strong about checks and balances. And in my opinion, this is a good checks and balances, even if it's a Republican president and a Republican Senate. I think you need checks and balances to make sure that not only is the president's vision going to be, moving forward, but ultimately that the will of the people is heard, and that everything that is done in government is directed towards the people. It goes back to, as you mentioned, the Constitution.
Yeah, and I think there's also part of the process of, and it's just sort of deference that the Senate will normally give to presidents when it comes to cabinet picks, and saying, okay, if you want Chris as your cabinet, your Secretary of State, unless there is something, like you said, he doesn't know that Africa is a continent, he doesn't know who the King of England is, unless there is something, that really causes a problem, generally speaking, and throughout most of American history. And we'll discuss in a minute some that weren't approved, but generally speaking, most cabinet members are approved. But there's a process that they generally go through, and it a lot of that process actually precedes that hearing, the all important hearing, and then the ultimate vote of the committee, and then the vote on the Senate floor. One of those things is you've got an FBI background check. So if Chris is a secret criminal, we find out about that during the FBI check, the background check. They do financial disclosures where they have to disclose all their tax information and investments and things like that. I mean, it could be a grueling process. And Chris, I tell you, if somebody is president and they nominate me for a position on the cabinet, my response to that's going to be thank you, but I will pass, because the process is just absolutely grueling. And when these cabinet officials or nominees go before the Senate committee for these hearings, it can last all day for 2, 3 days in a row, and it is just brutal. It can be very brutal when it's the opposite party doing the questioning. And Chris, you know this, they will literally go through people's garbage. They'll go back to their high school yearbooks. They will talk to everybody. They will dig up anything and everything they can dig up. So it's a brutal process, not a process I would want to go through personally.
No, it's a brutal process, but it's one that I think is needed and it's justified. But it's also very rare that a particular person nominated by the president is rejected. There was I remember I think it was 1989 when George H.W. Bush nominated John Tower, uh, who was a senator from Texas, to be his Secretary of Defense, and so normally say, okay, not a problem. But what happened was that John Tower, there was some things in his past. I think it was excessive drinking. There might have been some issues as it relates to, say, quote, womanizing. But there were some things that troubled some of the people and said, I don't know if we want this guy to head the Defense Department. It's just not good. And so, there was these documents, there was this research that went in, and so people said, we're not going to allow this person to be Secretary of Defense. Good guy, but just not the person qualified to be Secretary of Defense. So we're going to have to put that to the side. Mr. President, you have to select someone else. And I know I said, don't get into politics, that I wouldn't get into it, but I think it's so important because if you look, there's a lot of scrutiny right now as it relates to Trump's selection of Matt Gaetz to be the Attorney General of the United States. I don't know Matt Gaetz, never met him, know nothing about him. He's a Florida representative, whatever. I don't know him. But what I do know is that there's so much controversy that is out there right now, about this individual who is slated to be the top lawyer, I guess is what that is, as an Attorney General of the United States, the head lawyer. And so it's a John Tower situation, right? Because there's some background information that seems to be out there about him, about some of the same things, maybe a little bit different.
And some of it probably, if you think about Tower, it was drinking. Some of his stuff for Gates could be worse.
And I don't know, because like I said, don't know him, don't know anything, don't know. But what is interesting to me, and this is not political, this is just theoretical. We're just talking about how you do advice and consent. But let's look at that person right now that is relevant. Here we are, advice and consent. You have a president who has said, I want this guy to be my top lawyer, to be the Attorney General of the United States. He was, and until the day after he was nominated, or the day of he was nominated, he was a House of Representatives Congress member. He was under an ethics investigation. Once again, I don't know what is going on. I'm not part of it. It's all behind closed doors, whatever it is. But the day that he is nominated to be the Attorney General, he resigns his seat from Congress. Well, average everyday person says, well, yeah, that makes sense. He's resigning that job so he can go on and be the other job. But then what starts filtering out is that he's been under investigation of an ethics complaint.
Mm-hmm.
So if you are the president of the United States and you have an individual that you want to be your top lawyer underneath an investigative ethics complaint, whether he's not guilty, whether he's found to be no evidence whatsoever, usually you don't start an investigation unless you've got something that is kind of, yeah,
Where there's
something
smoke,
here.
there's fire.
Yeah. So,
Mm-hmm.
I guess the question is, why do that when, you are, that this is going on? But now the Senate has a responsibility, the advice and consent. Does the Senate sit there and say, president gets to choose who he wants, whatever it is, what it is? Or do they say, this doesn't look good?
Mm-hmm.
Because for whatever he is, whatever he's done, guilty, not guilty, doesn't matter, whatever that is, the reality is he's been investigated.
Mm-hmm.
Does it look good for the American people to bring somebody in who's got all of that baggage with them?
Yeah, and staying on the Gaetz nomination, if you're going in as president, you're president elect, and you have someone that, okay, they supported you during your campaign, they supported, they're a friend of yours, and they're already in government, and you think, well, I would like to give them a position. Um, and they're under some ethics issues, there's some things going on, why not hold off on that appointment? Because you're going to be president for 4 years. So hold off on that appointment, appoint someone else, and maybe if this person's cleared later on, appoint them to a position. Or Chris, you could always do, just appoint them to something much further down the line. And that way you don't have to worry about nomination process before the Senate. You can just put them further down the food chain, so to speak. So, this is, as you point out rightly, this is part of that all important checks and balances. The president of the United States is a very powerful person. I don't want what I'm getting ready to say be taken out of context. The president's a very powerful office. They had, as you mentioned earlier in the episode, the executive branch of government, which we talked about in an earlier episode about the Eisenhower office building. I mean, thousands of people work in the executive office of the president, and the president heads that office. So he or she is very powerful, but they are not all powerful. They are not monarchs. They have people who watch over them. Those people are Congress, the House, and here specifically the Senate. So they aren't allowed to do whatever they want to do. And I personally think a good argument can be made when you look at Article 1 of the Constitution that deals with the legislative branch. Then you look at Article 2, which deals with the executive branch. I think there's an argument to be made that over the last 50 years or more, Congress has given the presidents more and more leeway on numerous things. And I think now we're at a point where presidents are in reality more powerful than I think what it was originally intended to be. So even though I acknowledge that regardless of how things operate, the president's a very powerful individual, Chris, I'm actually an advocate for pushing a lot of those things back more toward Congress. Congress sort of taking the mantle, so to speak, and taking back some of the powers they've sort of handed off or to the president, or at least sort of let the president slide on.
And once again, I think about this in today's context. The incoming president of the United States has come in with a strong mandate. He has won the popular vote. He has won the electoral college.
Mhm.
His party has won the Senate.
Mhm.
His party has won the House. It is a clean sweep. There is no denying that. It
Right.
is reality. So there is a mandate from the United States of America that says the last 4 years have not been what we expected, what we want, and we demand different. So, understanding you've been given the keys to the castle, you have to recognize you're going to have to work with all branches of government.
Right.
You're going to have to work with all parties. and truly do what you say that you want to do. And so I have a hard time understanding, why presidents, when they, I guess it's that power thing,
Hmm.
that when you are handed this,
Hmm.
you then throw controversial things into it that honestly doesn't need to be controversial. Because
Right.
I'm focusing on the Gates thing because that is truly the most controversial thing that one can do, because you're asking someone to be the highest lawyer in the land who is also under a pretty strong investigative complaint. Why not just be transparent and say, not a good move, bad move. Now, it is interesting because if I'm not mistaken, every president has, in our modern day president, has taken a candidate that they selected and they're like, oh, this isn't a very good person. And they've kind of taken them off the plate, if you
Yeah.
will. They've not renounced, but they've kind of just said, this person is no longer going to be considered for this particular thing. I remember Clinton did it. I think it was in '96 with a particular person, and found out some things. It was like, instead of suffering humiliation and embarrassment for you, you know what we're going to do? We're just going to bypass it.
Yeah, and you're the Supreme Court guy. In 2005, George W. Bush nominated one Harriet Miers to the Supreme Court. Remember this?
Yeah.
And I mean, it didn't take long before that blew up and she was quickly pulled. I don't remember if she was pulled or if she stepped out, but I mean, if she stepped out, we know why.
Right.
Um, it's one thing I think for a president to nominate someone who they believe is the best person for the job, and maybe the Senate is, being held by a different party and they have maybe some ideological objections to this person. But I think going back to what you were saying, it's another thing altogether when a president inflicts an unnecessary wound on their brand new administration, by nominating someone who comes in under a shadow. I think it's best for them to nominate people who are highly qualified and would do a good job. And Chris, one thing that's being talked about, and I want to get this in, is a possible recess appointment that Trump might try to adjourn the Senate and try to appoint someone like a Matt Gaetz during that adjournment. And the Constitution, and I don't want to take up too much time because we don't have much time left, but the Constitution does give the president the authority to make what I would call temporary appointments during senatorial recesses. And those appointments, I say temporary because they only last for that
For
session
that session.
for that session of the Senate. So what? So it's not, it wouldn't be a long-term appointment, but it almost be like a temp. There's agencies out there called temp agencies. They hire someone that they will send someone to a company to work for that company. If the company likes them, then they'll eventually hire them. So it's sort of the same process. A recess appointment is like someone being brought on as a temp and then either being let go or brought on permanent full time at a later date. But this is something that is being talked about. And, I mentioned a second ago being brought into a cabinet position under a cloud. This would certainly do it. Trump would not be the first president to try this, by the way. I've heard some people in talking about the recess appointment act as if it would be like the end of the democracy. But number one, the Constitution allows it. Number two, other presidents have done it successfully or unsuccessfully. Barack Obama tried it in 2012 and got knocked down by the courts. But this is one of those things that can happen where a president does try to sneak someone in during a recess. But that recess, Chris, the court said has to be at least 10 days.
Yeah, and that's basically telling everybody to go home for 10 days.
Yeah.
And the last 10-day recess that senators had was in 2016. So it's not something that they do often. But I'm going to just go back to this. The craziness of politics that we're in now. You've been given a mandate.
Right.
You have won everything that you could possibly want. It's important for there to be transparency. And so I do hope that whoever is in power and whatever is going to happen with our Senate, that they will say, you know what, let's get our country off to a good start. We are divided. That's no mistaking about that. It is divided. So the Senate has a great opportunity to say, Mr. President, we respect the fact that you won. Ladies and gentlemen, we, the people of the nation, we respect the duty that we have to create a clear and very transparent system of government. So what we're going to do is every one of these people, we'll bring them before the Senate, let it be a televised hearing. If you've got 1 hour to do it, 1 hour, 5 hours, 5 hours, but put everybody out there so they know who's going to be head of these things. And then if everybody feels good with it, move on. And if not, find somebody else. But I do think that if I was president of the United States, I'd want to start off with a very transparent government and say, guys, here's what I promised. Here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to do the right thing. And I'm going to show you I'm going to do the right thing because I'm going to involve checks and balances. I'm going to bring the legislative branch into this. So I hope that happens. I know off the air you were talking about that the House is kind of doing some things about the Gaetz thing, and that's not really showing transparency. But hopefully the after some time, people will realize, for the sake of the country, we have all of these resources at our disposal. Let's do it right.
Yeah, and just to sort of wrap things up, in American history, there have been 9 cabinet members, only 9, that have been rejected by the Senate. Now, there are others who, like we talked about earlier, pull back or were pulled back, but only 9. And I think, Chris, your point about, transparency and, just getting started on the right foot is very, very important. Hopefully, maybe, I know it's unlikely, but hopefully maybe some very powerful people in Washington, D.C. will listen to this podcast and be inspired, Chris, by your wisdom.
Yeah, if they want us to come up there and help them through the process, I mean, we're more than happy to walk the hallowed halls and just talk about the simplicity. Because can I just say, it's that simple.
Yeah.
It's not rocket science. It's that simple. Don't have to like the people, but if they're qualified, let them do it. If they're not qualified, don't let them do it. And let's just move forward and let's try to do what is right for the people of the United States.
Very good. Very well said. Well, folks, we hope you've enjoyed this episode of History You Didn't Know But Should. We ask that you like this podcast on wherever you're listening to it, Spotify, whatever, wherever you're listening to it. And I will land this plane eventually, Chris. Chris is smiling. I will land this plane. Also share the podcast with your family and friends. Until next time, I'm Ray.
And I'm Chris.
And we'll talk to you later.